The tension in Harlem's corner store was thick enough to cut with a knife. An elderly black woman stood frozen at the counter, her weathered hands trembling as a young white clerk pointed an accusing finger at her purse. The other customers had gone silent, sensing the danger crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. "I saw you slip that candy bar into your bag, lady," the clerk sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You people think you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want?" The woman's name was Margaret Johnson. She was 67 years old, had cleaned white folks' houses for 40 years, and had never stolen so much as a penny in her entire life. But none of that mattered to the young man behind the counter. All he saw was an easy target. What the clerk didn't know was that Margaret Johnson had a son. And that son wasn't just any ordinary man walking the streets of Harlem. "Please, sir," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "I paid for everything. Check your register." The clerk laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the cramped store. "Don't lie to me, Grandma. I know you're kind. Always trying to work some angle, always looking for a free ride." The other customers shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just about a candy bar anymore. This was about respect. This was about dignity. This was about a line that should never be crossed. But the clerk was just getting started. He grabbed Margaret's purse and dumped its contents across the counter. Coins scattered and rolled onto the floor. Her reading glasses cracked against the hard surface. A small photograph of her late husband fluttered to the ground. "Look at this mess," the clerk said, rifling through her belongings like they were garbage. "Bet you got all kinds of stolen goods in here." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she held her head high. She had survived the Depression, buried a husband, and raised children in a world that didn't want to give them a chance. She wouldn't break now. Not for this boy who didn't know the first thing about struggle. The bell above the store's entrance chimed softly as the door opened. Margaret looked up, and for the first time since this nightmare began, relief washed over her face. Her son had arrived. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped into that store like he owned it. 6 feet tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than the clerk made in a month. His presence filled the room instantly, commanding attention without saying a word. Bumpy's eyes took in the scene in seconds. His mother's scattered belongings, her tears, the smug expression on the clerk's face. The uncomfortable silence of the other customers who wanted to help but didn't dare. To understand what happened next, you need to go back and understand who Bumpy Johnson really was. This wasn't some street thug or common criminal. This was a man who had built an empire in Harlem through intelligence, strategy, and an unshakable code of honor. He was someone who believed that respect wasn't given, it was earned. And anyone who disrespected his family would learn that lesson the hard way. Bumpy had grown up in these streets when they were even meaner than they were now. He'd learned early that the world would try to break you if you let it, but he'd also learned something else. Sometimes the quietest men were the most dangerous. Sometimes the best revenge was served with a smile and a plan. The clerk looked up as Bumpy approached the counter, and for a moment, his confidence wavered. There was something about this man that screamed danger, even though he moved with the grace of a dancer and spoke with the polish of a college professor. "Excuse me," Bumpy said, his voice calm and controlled. "I believe you have my mother's belongings spread across your counter." The clerk's bravado returned quickly. After all, what could one man do? This was his store, his territory. He had the law on his side. "Your mother's a thief," the clerk said, puffing out his chest. "I caught her red-handed stealing candy. I'm calling the police." Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a shark might give just before it strikes. "Is that so?" Bumpy asked, picking up his mother's photograph from the floor and dusting it off carefully. "And you saw this with your own eyes?" "Damn right I did," the clerk shot back. "I know her type, always looking for something for nothing." The other customers exchanged glances. They could feel the temperature in the room dropping by degrees. This wasn't going to end well for somebody. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and the clerk tensed, expecting trouble. But instead of a weapon, Bumpy pulled out a clean white handkerchief and began polishing his mother's glasses. "Her type," Bumpy repeated slowly as if tasting the words. Tell me, son, what exactly do you think her type is? The clerk, emboldened by what he thought was weakness, leaned forward. You know exactly what I mean. Poor, desperate, probably on welfare. The kind that thinks the world owes them something. Bumpy finished cleaning his mother's glasses and handed them to her gently. Margaret took them with shaking hands, but her son's presence had already begun to calm her. I see, Bumpy said. And what's your name, young man? Tommy, the clerk replied, suddenly unsure why he was answering. Well, Tommy, Bumpy said, straightening his tie, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. You see, my mother is many things. She's a woman who raised 7 children on her own after my father died. She's someone who worked 3 jobs to keep food on our table. She's the kind of person who would give her last dollar to help a neighbor in need. Bumpy's voice never rose above conversational level, but somehow every word carried the weight of a thunderclap. What she is not, Bumpy continued, is a thief. And what you are about to discover, Tommy, is that accusing her of being one was the biggest mistake of your very short career in retail. The clerk laughed nervously. Are you threatening me, pal? Because I got news for you. I don't scare easy. Bumpy tilted his head slightly like a predator studying its prey. Threatening you? Tommy, I think you've misunderstood the situation entirely. That's when the store's manager emerged from the back office, drawn by the commotion. He was a middle-aged Italian man named Mr. Torino, and the moment he saw Bumpy Johnson standing in his store, the color drained from his face. Because Mr. Torino knew exactly who Bumpy Johnson was, and he knew that what happened in the next few minutes would determine whether his store stayed open or became just another vacant building on Lenox Avenue. But what none of them knew yet, not Tommy, not Mr. Torino, not even Margaret herself, was that Bumpy Johnson hadn't just walked into that store by accident. He'd been watching, he'd been planning, and what was about to unfold would become the stuff of legend in Harlem, a story that would be told and retold for generations about the day someone made the fatal mistake of disrespecting Bumpy Johnson's mother. The game was about to change, and Tommy the clerk was about to learn why you never ever cross the wrong family in Harlem. Mr. Torino rushed forward, his face pale as fresh snow. He'd been running this corner store for 15 years, and in all that time he'd learned one golden rule about Harlem: some men you didn't mess with. Ever. Bumpy Johnson was at the top of that very short list. Mr. Johnson, Torino stammered, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. I didn't know you were here. Is there a problem? Tommy looked between his boss and this stranger, confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. Mr. Torino, I caught this old lady stealing candy. I'm handling it. The manager's eyes went wide with horror. He grabbed Tommy's arm so hard the young man winced. You did what? I said I caught her stealing, Tommy repeated, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. What's the big deal? It's just some old... Shut up, Torino hissed, cutting him off. Just shut up right now. But Bumpy raised his hand gently, a gesture that somehow commanded absolute silence from everyone in the store. When he spoke, his voice remained as calm as a summer evening, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. No, please let the young man finish, Bumpy said, his eyes never leaving Tommy's face. I'm curious to hear what he was about to call my mother. Tommy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Something about the way this man spoke, the way he carried himself, the way even his boss seemed terrified. It was starting to dawn on him that he might have stepped into something bigger than he understood. I was just doing my job, Tommy mumbled. Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. Your job. I see. And tell me, Tommy, what exactly does your job description say about treating customers? To serve them respectfully? Respectfully, Bumpy repeated, tasting the word. And do you feel that dumping my mother's purse on the counter and calling her a thief falls under that category? Tommy looked to his manager for support, but Torino had gone even paler, if that was possible. The Italian man knew the stories. He knew what happened to people who crossed Bumpy Johnson. Not the Hollywood nonsense, but the real thing, the way problems just disappeared. Look, I'm sorry if I was rude, Tommy said, his bravado crumbling. But I know what I saw. She took that candy bar. That's when Bumpy did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the shark smile from before, but something warmer, almost grandfatherly. Tommy, let me ask you something, Bumpy said, reaching into his pocket again. How much does that candy bar cost? 15 cents, Tommy replied, confused. Bumpy pulled out a roll of bills that could have choked a horse. He peeled off a 20 and placed it on the counter. There, I've just bought every candy bar in your store. Does that solve your problem? Tommy stared at the money. $20 was more than he made in 2 weeks. Yes, sir, but nothing, Bumpy continued. Now, I want you to very carefully think about what you're going to say next, because you have a choice to make, young man. You can apologize to my mother for your behavior, help her gather her belongings, and we can all pretend this unfortunate misunderstanding never happened. Tommy's relief was visible. Yes, sir, I can do that. Or, Bumpy continued, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. You can continue to insist that my mother is a thief, in which case I'm going to ask you to prove it. The clerk hesitated. Something in Bumpy's tone suggested that proving it would be very, very difficult. See, Tommy, Bumpy said, walking slowly around the counter. I've been watching this store for the past month. My mother comes here every Tuesday to buy her weekly supplies. Same routine, same time, same items. And in all that time, has she ever caused trouble? Tommy shook his head reluctantly. In fact, Bumpy continued, I happen to know that 2 weeks ago when Mrs. Patterson's grandson came up short on milk money, my mother paid the difference out of her own pocket. Didn't she? Tommy's eyes widened. He did remember that. The old lady had quietly slipped him a dime when the kid couldn't afford his mother's groceries. And last month, Bumpy went on, when you miscounted the register and came up 40 cents short, who stayed after closing to help you look for the missing money? Tommy's face flushed red. It had been Margaret Johnson. She'd spent an hour helping him search every corner of the store until they found the missing coins that had rolled under the counter. Now, Bumpy said, his voice still deadly calm, I want you to look at my mother, really look at her, and tell me again that she's a thief. Tommy glanced at Margaret, who stood quietly gathering her scattered belongings, her dignity intact despite everything that had happened. He couldn't meet her eyes. Maybe I made a mistake, Tommy whispered. Maybe? Bumpy's voice carried a hint of steel now. Son, you didn't make a mistake, you made a choice. You chose to see an elderly black woman and assume the worst. You chose to humiliate her in front of strangers. You chose to treat her like she was less than human. The other customers had gone completely silent. Some looked ashamed for not speaking up earlier. Others seemed fascinated by this masterclass in controlled fury. Please, Tommy begged. I'm sorry, I'll apologize, I'll make it right. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. You know what, Tommy? I believe you would, if I let you. The young clerk's relief was short-lived as the full meaning of those words sank in. But you see, Bumpy continued, this isn't just about an apology anymore. This is about respect. This is about understanding that actions have consequences. And most importantly, this is about making sure this never happens again. Not to my mother. Not to anyone else's mother. Mr. Torino finally found his voice. Mr. Johnson, please, Tommy's just a kid. He made a mistake, but what, Mr. Torino? Bumpy turned those cold eyes on the manager. Are you telling me this is the first time something like this has happened in your store? Are you saying you've never noticed how certain customers get treated differently than others? The manager's silence was answer enough. I thought so, Bumpy nodded. Which means this isn't just Tommy's problem anymore. This is your problem too. Bumpy pulled out a business card and placed it next to the $20 bill. Tommy, I want you to do something for me. I want you to take this card and visit the address on it tomorrow at noon. Tommy picked up the card with trembling hands. The address was in the nicest part of Harlem. What's there? Tommy asked. A job interview, Bumpy replied. My associate runs a moving company. Hard work, but honest work. The kind of job where you learn the value of treating people right. Tommy stared at the card. I, I don't understand. It's simple, Bumpy explained. You're going to quit working here. Today. Right now. And you're going to take that job assuming you can prove you're worth the chance I'm giving you. But this is my job. I need this job. Bumpy's expression didn't change. No, Tommy. You needed to think about that before you decided to humiliate my mother. Actions have consequences, remember? The clerk looked desperately at his manager, but Torino was staring at the floor, unwilling to meet his eyes. And if I refuse? Tommy asked, though he already knew he didn't really have a choice. Bumpy's smile returned, and this time it was definitely the shark variety. Well, he said softly, let me put it this way. That job I'm offering you? It's the best offer you're going to get in this neighborhood. In fact, I have a feeling it might be the only offer you're going to get in this neighborhood. The implication hung in the air like smoke. In Harlem, when Bumpy Johnson said someone was unwelcome, they became unwelcome. Fast. Tommy's shoulders slumped in defeat. When do I start? Tomorrow at noon, Bumpy replied. Don't be late. And Tommy? The first month is probationary. That means you're going to work harder than you've ever worked in your life. You're going to learn what it means to treat people with respect. And if you can't handle that, well, there are plenty of other neighborhoods in New York City. Margaret Johnson finished gathering her belongings and looked at her son. Ellsworth, she said quietly. That's enough. But Bumpy wasn't done. Not even close. Because what Tommy didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this little incident was about to spiral into something much bigger. Something that would involve the police, the city council, and changes that would echo through Harlem for years to come. The game had just begun. And Bumpy Johnson was about to show everyone why you never ever disrespect the wrong family. As Tommy began cleaning out his register with shaking hands, Bumpy leaned close and whispered something that made the young man's blood run cold. By the way, Tommy, he said so quietly that only the clerk could hear, I know where you live. Tommy walked out of that store like a man heading to his own execution. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Bumpy Johnson had just set the first domino in a chain reaction that would shake Harlem to its core. 3 days later, Bumpy sat in his usual booth at Sugar Ray's, the kind of establishment where conversations happened in whispers and handshakes, sealed deals worth more than most people's annual salary. Across from him sat Detective Ray Collins, one of the few honest cops left in the precinct. You sure you want to do this, Bumpy? Collins asked, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Once this gets out, there's no going back. Bumpy opened the envelope and examined the photographs inside. Clear shots of Tommy roughing up other elderly customers, Mrs. Washington getting her groceries scattered, old Mr. Peters being accused of shortchanging the register. 3 months of documented harassment, all captured by the new security camera Bumpy had quietly installed across the street. Ray, Bumpy said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Some things are bigger than business. Some things are about principle. What Collins didn't know was that Bumpy had been planning this for months. The incident with his mother wasn't random. It was inevitable. Tommy had a pattern and Bumpy had been documenting every single occurrence. But the photographs were just the beginning. Bumpy's real strategy was unfolding 3 blocks away, where his associate Marcus Washington was having a very different kind of conversation with City Councilman Robert Sterling. You understand what we're asking, Councilman? Marcus said, placing a thick folder on Sterling's mahogany desk. New ordinances, anti-discrimination policies for local businesses, real consequences for harassment of elderly customers. Sterling flipped through the proposed legislation, his eyebrows rising with each page. This is comprehensive. But getting something like this through committee will take months, maybe years. Marcus smiled. Councilman, let me tell you a story about expedited processes. What Sterling didn't know was that the folder contained more than just proposed legislation. Hidden between the legal documents were photographs of the councilman leaving the Continental Hotel at 2 a.m. with someone who definitely wasn't his wife. Of course, Marcus continued smoothly, my employer understands that political change takes time. But he also believes that when good men work together, Miracles can happen in weeks instead of years. Sterling's face went pale as he spotted his own photograph peeking out from behind a legal brief. I see what you mean about miracles. Excellent, Marcus said, standing up. Mr. Johnson will be so pleased to hear about your sudden interest in expedited civil rights legislation. Meanwhile, across town, Bumpy's other lieutenant, smooth-talking Vincent Silk Morrison, was having tea with Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the society woman who owned half the commercial real estate in Harlem. I must say, Mrs. Hartwell, Silk said, stirring his Earl Grey with practiced elegance, your tenants have been interesting to observe. Mrs. Hartwell, 73 and sharp as a tack, studied the young man across from her. She hadn't survived 40 years in New York real estate by being naive. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Morrison? Silk reached into his briefcase and pulled out a ledger. I'm suggesting that some of your commercial tenants might benefit from a refresher course in customer service, particularly as it relates to elderly and minority customers. Mrs. Hartwell examined the ledger. Page after page of documented incidents, timestamps, witness statements, a pattern of discrimination so clear that even a blind judge couldn't miss it. This is quite thorough, she admitted. Mr. Johnson believes in thorough documentation, Silk replied. He also believes in giving people opportunities to correct their mistakes before those mistakes become legal liabilities. Mrs. Hartwell understood perfectly. Discrimination lawsuits were expensive, messy, and very bad for business. What does Mr. Johnson propose? Mandatory sensitivity training for all customer-facing employees, written policies prohibiting discriminatory behavior, and most importantly, consequences for violations. And if my tenants refuse? Silk's smile was as sharp as a razor blade. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sure you're aware that Mr. Johnson has been quietly acquiring properties throughout the neighborhood. He's always looking for new locations for businesses that understand the value of treating customers with respect. The implication was crystal clear. Comply, or watch your tenants get squeezed out by businesses that would. But Bumpy's masterstroke was still to come. 2 weeks after the incident at Torino's store, a letter arrived at the offices of the Amsterdam News, Harlem's most influential newspaper. The letter was typed on expensive stationery and signed simply, "A Friend of Justice." Editor-in-Chief James Mitchell read the letter twice before calling his best investigative reporter into his office. "Sarah," he said, handing her the letter, "I want you to look into this quietly." Sarah Chen read the letter, her eyes widening with each paragraph. It detailed systematic harassment of elderly customers throughout Harlem's commercial district. It provided specific dates, times, and locations. It named names. "This is incredibly specific," Sarah said. "Whoever wrote this has been documenting everything for months." "That's what concerns me," Mitchell replied. "People don't collect this kind of evidence unless they're planning to use it." What Mitchell didn't know was that the letter was just the opening salvo. Over the next week, Sarah would receive anonymous tips leading her to witnesses, photographs, and documents that would expose a pattern of discrimination so widespread it would shock even veteran civil rights activists. Back at Sugar Ray's, Bumpy was explaining his strategy to Detective Collins over coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "You see, Ray, most people think power comes from fear. They're wrong. Real power comes from being useful to the right people at the right time." Collins nodded, though he wasn't sure he entirely understood. "Right now," Bumpy continued, "I'm useful to Councilman Sterling because I can solve his political problems. I'm useful to Mrs. Hartwell because I can prevent legal problems. I'm useful to the Amsterdam News because I can give them the story of the decade. And what do you get out of it?" Bumpy's smile was enigmatic. "I get a Harlem where my mother can buy groceries without being humiliated. I get a neighborhood where respect isn't negotiable." But Collins could see there was more to it than that. "What aren't you telling me, Bumpy?" That's when Bumpy pulled out one final photograph. This one showed a well-dressed white man in an expensive suit shaking hands with Tommy outside the store. "Who's that?" Collins asked. "That," Bumpy said, "is District Attorney Harrison Walsh, and he's been very interested in our friend Tommy's employment status. Collins felt his blood run cold. Walsh was known for his political ambitions and his willingness to use racial tensions to advance his career. You're saying Walsh was behind this? I'm saying Walsh has been looking for an excuse to crack down on what he calls undesirable elements in Harlem. A simple theft case involving an elderly black woman would have given him exactly the headlines he needed. Collins stared at the photograph. But Tommy quit. There's no case. Bumpy's smile turned predatory. Exactly. Which means Walsh is about to discover that his carefully laid plans have just blown up in his face. That's when it all clicked for Collins. This wasn't just about justice for Margaret Johnson. This was about preventing a larger injustice. This was about protecting the entire community from a political opportunist who would have used one family's pain to advance his own career. Jesus, Bumpy, Collins whispered. How far ahead do you think? As far as I need to, Bumpy replied. But Ray, the game's not over yet. Walsh isn't the type to just walk away. He's going to try to salvage something from this mess. What do you mean? Bumpy stood up, straightening his tie with the same careful precision he brought to everything else in his life. I mean, tomorrow morning, District Attorney Walsh is going to hold a press conference. He's going to announce a major initiative to combat organized crime in Harlem. And guess whose name is going to be at the top of his list? Collins felt his stomach drop. Yours. Mine, Bumpy confirmed. Which means phase 2 of this little game is about to begin. As Bumpy walked toward the door, Collins called after him. What's phase 2? Bumpy paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon sun streaming through the windows of Sugar Ray's. Phase 2, he said quietly, is where District Attorney Walsh learns the difference between hunting a mouse and hunting a lion. But what neither Collins nor anyone else knew was that Bumpy had been expecting Walsh's move all along. In fact, he'd been counting on it, because tomorrow's press conference wasn't going to go the way Walsh planned. Not even close. The trap was set. The pieces were in motion. And Bumpy Johnson was about to remind everyone in New York City why you never underestimate a man who's fighting for his family's honor. They thought they were hunting him. They had no idea they were walking into a war they couldn't win. District Attorney Harrison Walsh straightened his tie and stepped up to the podium, surrounded by a sea of reporters and camera flashes. City Hall's press room was packed beyond capacity. This was his moment, the announcement that would catapult his political career into the stratosphere. Ladies and gentlemen, Walsh began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who believed he held all the cards. Today marks a turning point in our fight against organized crime in Harlem. Behind him stood an easel covered by a black cloth, concealing what Walsh promised would be evidence that will shock the citizens of New York. For too long, Walsh continued, certain criminal elements have operated with impunity in our neighborhoods. They've intimidated honest business owners, corrupted local officials, and turned entire blocks into their personal kingdoms. The cameras rolled. The reporters scribbled notes. Walsh was building toward his grand reveal. What Walsh didn't know was that in the back of the room, Sarah Chen from the Amsterdam News was holding a manila envelope that would change everything. An envelope that had been delivered to her hotel room at exactly 6 a.m., along with a note that read simply, "Open at 10:15 a.m. But it was now 10:14 a.m. 14. Today, Walsh announced dramatically, I'm proud to present evidence of a criminal conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of Harlem's underworld. He pulled away the black cloth, revealing a detailed organizational chart with photographs and connecting lines. At the top, in bold letters, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, criminal mastermind. The room erupted with questions and camera flashes. This man, Walsh said, pointing to Bumpy's photograph, has been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise for years. Extortion, illegal gambling, intimidation of witnesses, the list goes on. Walsh paused for effect, savoring what he believed was his moment of triumph. In fact, he continued, just last week Mr. Johnson was involved in an incident at a local grocery store where he threatened and intimidated a young clerk who was simply doing his job. That's when Sarah Chen opened her envelope. Inside were photographs that made her blood run cold. Pictures of Walsh meeting secretly with known criminals. Financial records showing suspicious payments to his campaign. And most damning of all, a transcript of a recorded phone conversation where Walsh discussed using racial incidents to advance his political career. Sarah looked at her watch. 10:15 a.m. exactly. She stood up in the back of the room. "Mr. Walsh?" she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I have a question about your timeline." Walsh squinted into the bright lights, unable to clearly see who was speaking. "Yes? You mentioned an incident at a grocery store last week. Are you referring to the incident where an elderly woman was falsely accused of theft and publicly humiliated?" Walsh's confidence faltered slightly. "Well, that's under investigation, but—" "Because," Sarah continued, pulling out her notebook, "I have witness statements here that paint a very different picture. According to multiple sources, the elderly woman in question, Mrs. Margaret Johnson, was the victim of harassment, not a criminal incident." The room went silent. Walsh could feel his carefully orchestrated moment slipping away. "Furthermore," Sarah pressed on, "I have evidence that suggests this incident was part of a larger pattern of discrimination against elderly and minority customers throughout the district." Walsh's face was turning red. That's not relevant to the criminal conspiracy I'm exposing here today." "Isn't it?" Sarah asked. "Because according to my investigation, the criminal mastermind you're targeting today is the same man who helped expose this discrimination pattern. The same man who's been working with local business owners to implement anti-discrimination policies." The reporters in the room began murmuring among themselves. This wasn't the story they'd expected to cover. That's when Detective Collins entered the room from a side door, carrying a briefcase and wearing the grim expression of a man about to end someone's career. Walsh spotted him immediately. "Detective Collins, perfect timing. Please tell these reporters about the criminal activities you've witnessed." Collins approached the podium slowly, like a man walking to a funeral. "Actually, Mr. Walsh, I'm here to present evidence of a different kind of criminal activity." Walsh's smile froze. "What do you mean?" Collins opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. 2 hours ago, I submitted a formal complaint to Internal Affairs regarding corruption in the district attorney's office." The room exploded with questions, but Collins held up his hand for silence. "The complaint includes recorded conversations, financial records, and photographic evidence of a conspiracy to manufacture criminal cases for political gain." Walsh went white as a sheet. "You can't be serious. This is some kind of setup." "Is it?" Collins asked. "Because I have a recording here of a conversation between you and convicted felon Mickey Torino, where you discuss paying him to create incidents that would justify increased police presence in Harlem." The reporters were frantically scribbling notes now. This was the story of the decade. But Collins wasn't finished. "I also have bank records showing payments from your campaign fund to various individuals in exchange for false testimony against Mr. Johnson." Walsh grabbed the podium for support. His political career was imploding in real time, broadcast live on 3 television networks. "This is impossible," Walsh stammered. "How could you? When did you?" That's when the back door of the press room opened and Bumpy Johnson walked in. He moved through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. Reporters stepped aside instinctively, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Bumpy approached the podium with the calm confidence of a man who had orchestrated every moment of the past hour. "Mr. Walsh?" Bumpy said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I believe you wanted to see me?" Walsh stared at him in shock. "How? How are you here? You should be in custody by now." Bumpy smiled that dangerous smile. "Should I be? Based on what evidence? The evidence you manufactured? The witnesses you paid? The incidents you staged?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Walsh protested, but his voice was weak. Bumpy reached into his jacket and pulled out a small tape recorder. "Then perhaps this will refresh your memory." He pressed play, and Walsh's own voice filled the room. "We need something big, Mickey. Something that will make these Harlem people look like the animals they are. A robbery, an assault, something that will get me headlines." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes strobed like lightning. Walsh stood frozen at the podium watching his career die in real time. "You see, Mr. Walsh," Bumpy said, his voice somehow audible above the chaos. "You made one crucial mistake. You assumed I was just another street criminal you could manipulate and destroy." Walsh couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. "But what you failed to understand," Bumpy continued, "is that I've been playing this game longer than you've been alive. And in my game, the house always wins." Sarah Chen stood up in the back of the room. "Mr. Johnson, do you have any comment on the charges that were about to be filed against you?" Bumpy turned to address her, and through her, the cameras that were broadcasting this moment across the city. "I have one comment," he said. "In Harlem, we take care of our own. We protect our families. We respect our elders. And when someone tries to use our pain for their political gain, we make sure they understand the consequences of that choice." Walsh finally found his voice. "This isn't over, Johnson. I'll find another way to—" "No," Bumpy interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. "It is over. Because in about 5 minutes, every major newspaper in the city is going to receive copies of everything Detective Collins just presented. Your corruption, your lies, your contempt for the people you swore to serve." Bumpy stepped closer to the microphone. "And tomorrow morning, those same newspapers are going to run stories about how the people of Harlem stood up to a corrupt prosecutor who tried to manufacture crimes for headlines. The reporters were loving every second of this. It was justice and drama and politics all rolled into one incredible story. But most importantly," Bumpy said, looking directly into the television cameras, "everyone in this city is going to know that Margaret Johnson, a 70-year-old woman who spent her life caring for others, was almost destroyed by a man who saw her pain as a political opportunity." Walsh slumped against the podium, defeated. His political career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His carefully laid plans had not just failed. They had backfired so spectacularly that he would be lucky to avoid criminal charges himself. As the reporters surged forward with questions, Bumpy walked calmly toward the exit. But just before he reached the door, he turned back one final time. "Oh, and Mr. Walsh," he called out across the chaos, "my mother wanted me to thank you." "Thank me?" Walsh asked weakly. "For what?" Bumpy's smile was pure satisfaction. "For reminding everyone in Harlem why family comes first and why respect isn't negotiable." As the door closed behind him, Walsh realized the horrible truth. He hadn't just lost this battle. He had started a war he never had any chance of winning. But the story wasn't over yet, because what happened next would turn Bumpy Johnson from a neighborhood legend into a symbol of justice that would inspire generations. The game was won, but the legend was just beginning. 6 months later, Harrison Walsh sat in a federal courthouse wearing an orange jumpsuit, his political dreams reduced to ashes. The corruption charges had stuck. Conspiracy, fraud, civil rights violations. The indictments read like a criminal mastermind's resume. But Walsh was no mastermind. He was just another small man who thought he could play a big game. The judge's gavel fell with finality. 25 years in federal prison. Walsh's wife had left him. His political party had disowned him. His law license was revoked. The man who had once dreamed of becoming governor would spend the rest of his productive years behind bars. A cautionary tale about the price of corrupting justice for personal gain. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, a young screenwriter named Mario Puzo was reading newspaper clippings about the Harlem incident, fascinated by the story of a man who had dismantled a corrupt prosecutor, using nothing but intelligence, patience, and an unshakable moral code. Those newspaper clippings would eventually inspire characters and scenes that would change American cinema forever. But that's getting ahead of the story. Back in Harlem, the changes were already visible. The new anti-discrimination ordinances that Councilman Sterling had rushed through committee were working. Business owners throughout the neighborhood had implemented customer service training programs. Elderly shoppers could walk into any store knowing they would be treated with dignity and respect. Tommy, the young clerk who had started this entire chain of events, was finishing his 3rd month at Marcus Washington's moving company. The work was hard but honest. More importantly, Tommy had learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Respect wasn't about fear. It was about recognizing the humanity in every person you met. He still lived in the same neighborhood, still walked the same streets. But now, when he passed elderly black women on the sidewalk, he tipped his hat and said, "Good morning." Not because he had to, but because he'd learned what it meant to be a man. One Tuesday afternoon, Tommy was helping Mrs. Patterson move to a new apartment when he saw a familiar figure across the street. Margaret Johnson was walking slowly toward the corner store, the same store where their paths had first crossed. Tommy excused himself and jogged across the street. "Mrs. Johnson," he called out, slightly out of breath. Margaret turned, her weathered face showing no recognition at first. Then her eyes widened as the memory came back. "You're the young man from the store," she said quietly. Tommy nodded, suddenly feeling like that scared kid again. "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to. I needed to apologize. Properly. For how I treated you that day." Margaret studied his face for a long moment. She could see the changes, the humility, the genuine remorse, the hard-earned wisdom that only comes from real consequences. "Apology accepted," she said simply. Tommy felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Thank you, ma'am, and Mrs. Johnson, your son, he saved my life that day, I know that now." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that contained years of experience and understanding. "My Ellsworth has always believed that everyone deserves a second chance, but only if they're willing to earn it." That evening, Bumpy Johnson sat in his study, reading the latest reports from his various business interests. The numbers were good, better than good actually. The respect he'd earned from the Walsh incident had opened doors throughout the city. Legitimate businessmen wanted to partner with him. Politicians sought his counsel. Even the police treated him with a deference that bordered on reverence. But more importantly, the streets were quiet. The kind of quiet that came from understanding, not fear. People knew that justice was possible in Harlem. They knew that respect was non-negotiable. They knew that family came first. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in, Ma," he called without looking up. Margaret entered, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the kind of smile that made all of Bumpy's machinations worthwhile. "How did you know it was me?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Same knock you've been using for 40 years, Bumpy replied, finally looking up from his papers. "How was your shopping today?" Margaret's eyes twinkled with mischief. "That young man, Tommy, he apologized to me today. Really apologized. Like he meant it." Bumpy nodded. He'd been keeping tabs on Tommy's progress, of course. The boy was learning. Slowly, but learning. "Good," Bumpy said. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow." Margaret sipped her tea thoughtfully. "You know, son, what you did 6 months ago. That wasn't just about me, was it?" Bumpy set down his papers and really looked at his mother. At 70, she was still sharp as a tack, still able to see through his carefully constructed facades to the heart of things. "No, Ma," he admitted. "It wasn't. It was about all of us," she continued, "about making sure that what happened to me couldn't happen to anyone else's mother, or grandmother, or great-grandmother." Bumpy smiled. This was why he fought. This was why he planned. This was why he'd built an empire based on respect rather than fear. "The game's always been bigger than any one person," he said. "But sometimes it takes one person's pain to remind everyone what we're really fighting for." Margaret stood up, kissed her son on the forehead like she had when he was 7 years old, and headed for the door. "I'm proud of you, Ellsworth," she said without turning around. "Your father would be proud too." After she left, Bumpy walked to his window and looked out at the streets of Harlem. His streets, his people, his responsibility. The incident at the corner store had started as a simple case of disrespect, but it had become something much larger, a statement about dignity, about justice, about the price of underestimating the wrong family. Years later, when historians would write about the Harlem of the 1960s, they would note this period as a turning point. The moment when respect became non-negotiable. The The moment when the community realized it had the power to protect its own. They would call it the beginning of a new era. But for Bumpy Johnson, it was simpler than that. It was just Tuesday afternoon, and his mother had gone grocery shopping without being humiliated. That was victory enough. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. On the other end, Detective Collins had news about a situation developing in Queens. Another family being threatened. Another injustice that needed addressing. Bumpy Johnson straightened his tie, put on his hat, and headed for the door. After all, the game never really ended. It just moved to the next board. And in Harlem, respect wasn't just earned once. It was earned every single day. The legend of that Tuesday afternoon would be told and retold for generations. The day a store clerk learned the difference between power and respect. The day a corrupt prosecutor discovered that some families can't be broken. The day Harlem reminded the world that dignity isn't negotiable. But most importantly, it was the day everyone learned the most fundamental truth of all. Never, and I mean never, disrespect someone's mother. Because you never know who might be listening, and you definitely don't want to find out what happens next.